So it was interesting to see that a very large number of you were at the symposium or the summit on Wednesday. I'd first like to clarify that, yes, Andrew gave this presentation on Wednesday. I'm going to try and flesh up and add a bit of detail around it, and I am not Andrew's assistant stalker, for those of you who were at the meeting, in spite of what you said, Therese. So I've been involved in the development of the strategy with the team who's been working on this. It's included our team in the China market as well as a broad cross-section of the organisation in Sydney. And in the audience today, and I'm just looking around to find the faces, we have Li Wei, who is our Asia Development Manager. And Li Wei will be very involved in the implementation of the... Hey, Li Wei, there you are. Very involved. I was looking that way, so there you go. Very involved in the implementation of it. So if there's questions I can't answer, certainly Li Wei will be able to help me. So it really is my pleasure to be presenting this piece of work. It's a really important piece of work. We've been doing a lot of long-term strategic thinking in Tourism Australia, and obviously China becomes a key part of that long-term thinking. So I'm going to give you a perspective of the broad thinking as well as the focus on China. Okay. Andrew talked about how often in the media you read about China being an overnight success. But it is an overnight success which has been built on 12 years of hard work, strong partnership and a significant investment in building the China market in a way that it's working for both our countries. Australia was the first Western country to receive approved destination status, and with New Zealand, we both received it in 1999. Since then, there's now 140 countries that has ADS approval. Once we had that approval, we opened our office in Shanghai and started a very careful rollout implementation built around educating the distribution system and the channels first. And a key platform for that back then and continues to be now our Aussie Specialist program, which was very much about building expertise around the Australian product and being able to ensure that when we spoke with our Chinese consumers, we could talk to them in a meaningful way. Once the distribution has been built, we then look at our consumer marketing opportunities. One of the things we know about China is that the Chinese love Australia and our marketing of Australia. When we do research in China on developing our campaigns and then looking at the effectiveness of our campaigns, it is incredibly positive. There is such high engagement around Australia. And so we know that we have a product, as Wolfgang, you were saying earlier, that is a very positive and well-received product by the Chinese. All along this time, this 12 years, the foundation, though, has been built on partnership. And it has been a partnership across all elements of the industry, be it the local industry, the industry in China, aviation, with our states and territory colleagues, and most importantly on that foundation of working with the Chinese government and the CNTA and our whole of government approach with the Department of Resources, Energy and Tourism, with immigration and also with foreign affairs and trade. So as Wayne said, our overnight success has now resulted in the fact that we now welcome almost half a million Chinese to Australia, and it has now become our most important inbound market from an expenditure point of view. The other recent development, which I think continues to show the work being done, was that on April 26, when Prime Minister Gillard was in China, we had the signing of the new Memorandum of Understanding, which was about strengthening tourism cooperation between the two countries and about building on the ADS scheme and promoting cooperation in the emerging travel segments, such as individual, education and incentive travellers. So the platform's kind of well set to be looking at what's going to be coming after that foundation of 12 years. To give context to the China Strategic Plan, at Tourism Australia, once the National Long-Term Tourism Strategy had been launched by the Minister, as Wayne said, at the end of 2009, we then started a piece of work with the support of RET, looking at what could the potential of the tourism industry be by 2020. And this piece of work, it was obvious the key role that China was going to play in it. I'll just walk you through this slide so that it gives you the full strategic context that China then sits within. If you look at the graph at the bottom, this is looking at our historical overnight tourism expenditure numbers, and this work was done in mid-2010, so it's anchored off the end of 2009. And at that point, overnight tourism expenditure for Australia was $70 billion. We then did an economic analysis, which I'll talk about, which showed that the potential for tourism by 2020 could be as high as doubling that overnight tourism expenditure to $140 billion, and probably more likely in the range between $115 to $140 billion. The way how we did this work was we looked at 12 markets. We studied our domestic market and 11 international markets, and those markets are listed below. We looked at the demand pool of all outbound of those source markets. So we didn't just look at who was already coming to Australia. We looked at what was the opportunity of that full source pool for each market. What we built was an economic model that would very carefully and very robustly predict past behaviour in order to be able to develop economic forecasts for the future. So through that, we then looked at our performance in each of those markets, and then we developed forecasts. The sorts of assumptions we then paid, because the word competitiveness has been coming up a lot this morning, and what this model was built on was built around competitiveness. So we looked at what would happen if Australia held market share in those source markets. And then what we said, because we're developing here a vision, we need to look at what even improved performance would be, where we would be regaining market share. And as I think it hasn't been said directly, but it probably has been alluded to by some of the previous presentations, for many markets, that's a turnaround in performance. So the tourism industry potential is about saying we need to really focus on our competitiveness, look at those source markets, look at that opportunity, and start to turn around our performance. So based on that model, you can see the listing here of incremental growth by market. So this is not the total number, this is the incremental overnight growth. The market at the top, and more than double any other with the opportunity for incremental growth, was China. It makes sense. We know that China has strong economic growth. So that's the foundation of the modelling, and so you see, and it's off a very big existing base. So hence why China comes out so strongly. The other thing that's very important in that list, of course, is that our mature markets are still very important sources for us. And India, which gets a lot of discussion as well, is the second fastest growing market in that list, but it's off a smaller base. So from Tourism Australia's point of view, having a portfolio of markets is incredibly important. But obviously, China has a special role within that portfolio. And so that was why we, at that point in time, turned around and said, it's time for us to now do our 2020 strategic plan. So Tourism Australia's goal for the 2020 plan is to achieve the potential between $7 to $9 billion. In fact, we're going to go after the higher number because we want to kind of set ourselves as aggressive goals as possible. And in fact, we think it might even go a little bit higher if we can all work together and get it right. This would be about 860,000 visitors. And then we have also set competitive goals for ourselves around rankings and market shares, and completely in agreement with what Wolfgang said earlier, removing those markets that are not competitors for us. We are not competing against Hong Kong, Macau, Korea, those short-haul intra-region markets. So we've composed a market that is a market that's relevant for us to measure ourselves in. We then, within our strategic plan, we have the 5 pillars that Andrew spoke to. We've set up work teams against each of the 5 pillars. There is quite a bit more detail around this, but what I'm giving to you now is an overview, as was what Andrew did as well. The 5 pillars are stated here, and we're going to just touch on most of those. I'll start with partnerships now. To be really competitive in China, it's going to take everybody all pointing in that same direction. And so that's why a strategic plan is so important. In fact, Anton and Byron, who are going to be presenting later on, in fact helped us by taking the strategy out and doing interviews with people in China and people in Australia to validate the strategy and make sure that we're heading in the right direction. And since then, we've been doing ongoing consultation around the strategy with the states and territories and with industry, because we do need to be all pointing in the right direction and really getting the best value we can from our resources. We will also need to continue to close dialogue and work with CNTA, RET, DIAC and DFAT. And we have set up quite a lot of advisory boards and panels to guide us through this process. So partnership continues to be the foundation pillar as we move forward.